So today's session is on the impact of deep trade agreements, and this is the inaugural session of a mini series on the economics of deep trade agreements. The way the world is growing next year, we might have to do the economics of shallow trade agreements. But today we're focusing on deep trade agreements and their impact. We will also have upcoming sessions on the political economy, behind the border, barriers, services, and non-trade issues in deep trade agreements. So I'm going to just go ahead and start right away. Um, we have 3 papers being presented, and I'll introduce them now and the speakers now, so then we can just go ahead and get started. The first paper is going to be on income distribution, international integration, and sustained poverty reduction, and Tristan Reed is going to present. The second paper will be on machine learning and international trade research, evaluating the impact of trade agreements. And Tom Zylkin will present, who is an assistant professor at the University of Richmond. And of course, Tristan, who I just mentioned, is an economist at the World Bank. And finally, I think the third paper is a general equilibrium assessment of the economic impact of deep trade agreements. And that one will be presented by Lionel Fontagne, professor of economics at the Paris School of Economics. And he's on my screen, so I don't know if this is the order we're going to go in or if that's going first. No. Okay. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And all of these are joint works, but some have several authors. So rather than me reading them off, you can look at the program, or or the authors can announce, so I don't butcher any more names. So let's start with Tristan Reed and Income Distribution, International Integration, and Sustained Poverty Reduction. Tristan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolyn. Let me just share my screen. Good, everybody can see it? Great. So this is joint work with Penny Goldberg at Yale. What is the starting point? So, I think if we think back, what is the model of development that we know? What is the path to development that countries have? I think most examples from either East Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, are about export-led industrialization. This is how we think about the path to development. As Carolyn alluded, globalization and multilateralism that have facilitated export-led industrialization are reaching political limits. So, just a few examples. I think in the U.S., protectionism is often attributed to the Trump administration, but we forget that the consensus against the TPP was a bipartisan consensus in the U.S. The WTO is having challenges, doing appeals courts because of a lack of judges. And there's been blockages on liberalization of agriculture, which is an area that could potentially, or ends to state subsidies for agriculture in the rich countries could potentially help developing countries, but we haven't been able to see any progress on these issues. At the same time, concerns about the growth of automation and this technology has also raised concerns that the path to development through labor-intensive manufacturing may not be available to countries in the future. So that's kind of the background and the starting point for this paper. And we say that given these challenges, there's a need for potentially a new model or a new vision of development. And I want to just flag briefly some hypotheses that I think maybe aren't that compelling. So I think one idea people have talked about is services leapfrogging, so you can miss manufacturing and move on to services. This is a little bit under-theorized in the sense that we don't know where the growth in services will come from. But even more than that, in the WDR, countries grow much more faster when they get into simple manufacturing versus more sophisticated services, global value chains. I think urbanization is another idea, that people think that, for more density will allow countries to grow and reduce poverty. The nice paper by Doug Gollin and co-authors shows that, that hasn't been the case in Africa in a lot of cases of resource exporting countries. So you have these consumption cities that are not bases of production, and so there's density, but with not a lot of poverty reduction and economic development. What we want to talk about in this paper is the idea that the domestic market, and specifically equality, the size of the middle class in that domestic market, can provide an alternative path to development. I'll talk through very briefly some theory to think through why this might be. Then I'll get into the meat of the paper, which is the empirical implementation. And the main contribution here is that we're going to estimate this threshold model of development. So there's an idea that a country has to have a market of a certain size that can come from either the international market or the domestic market, and we want to know how big it is to achieve development. And I'll show you the results. I think for the interest of this audience, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a world. We'll say what has been the effect of the international market and the domestic market, and then we'll estimate a counterfactual in which there's no international market, so in which all trade agreements are shut down, and see how much development you could get without that. And so by that comparison, we'll understand also the effect of international integration through trade agreements. And just as a preview of our conclusions, we find that for a small country in this framework, it's nearly impossible to eliminate poverty if you're closed. And although openness is an important precondition for poverty elimination and development, you still need deep integration facilitated by the trade agreements that we're studying in this conference. But the alternative is to push for a larger middle class and more equality. So let's think through just a few examples to start. So I start with India. So this is a country that's been growing very quickly, also achieved a lot of poverty reduction, but with a trade deficit. So it's not a major. It is a major exporter, but that hasn't been a big part of its growth story. Actually, I'll flag that actually this year it went into a trade surplus, but that's because of a decline in imports rather than a boom in exports. So, the India example suggests that it may be possible for a large domestic market to make it easier to develop. And the idea could be that there are some sort of internal economies of scale that firms can achieve by serving that large market. But of course, there are counterexamples. So Nigeria, I think, is a very good one. It is also a very large country, very populous. It has rich in natural resources, but it hasn't been able to attain sustained development or poverty reduction. In fact, poverty is increasing and has been for the last decade or more. And so what this introduces is this idea that there might be some requirement to have a certain degree of equality in the society. So if you have an oil shock, it will be the revenue will be distributed across the population, generate demand, and that will generate a multiplier effect that can drive growth through the domestic economy. So you can think of maybe comparing Norway and Nigeria here. Norway is a country that had a big oil boom, but it was also had a lower inequality and also ways to distribute that wealth across society. So the idea that we get to from these examples is that you need a bit of equality for development. Just think through the theory very quickly. So what is development? It means that firms adopt an increasing returns to scale technology that is going to raise productivity, raise the wage rate, and then reduce poverty. This is a standard model. It goes back to Arthur Lewis. But the technology has a fixed cost. And so what that means is that there's a minimum market size that you need to make that adoption of the technology profitable. And so what we think is that you can attain this market size through either the domestic or international market. And so, old trade theory, starting with Krugman, has this idea that one of the benefits of international markets is that you can achieve economies of scale in addition to the gains from comparative advantage. So you can think of The old development model as being, countries capturing these larger domestic markets and then selling to them. But the alternative, that we want to explore here is the idea that you can achieve that scale with a domestic middle class. And there's a paper by Murphy, Schleifer, Vishny in the QJ. This is not the big push paper, though it was published in the same year, which actually proposes a specific mechanism and functional form that we're going to use in our paper. And so the idea here is very simple. It's just that this increasing return sector faces imperfect competition, so similar to the Krugman-Helpman framework, which is going to generate profits for the firms. So when you have a shock to agricultural productivity, which lowers wage rates, profits go up. You can also have a boost to export demand, which can similarly boost profits through the revenue channel. And the key mechanism is that if there's a bigger middle class, and the middle class is measured by the share of the population who own shares in these companies, that profit is going to translate into increased demand, which will then allow for a bigger market and further adoption of the increasing returns to scale technology. So that's the idea for how the domestic market could, in addition to the international market, promote development. So we're going to implement this empirically. We're following the industrial organization tradition, sort of Bresnahan and Rees. So we say that the profit in the increasing return sector has this simple form. So there's S is the market size, those market size variables M. V is a variable profit term, function of demand shifter Z and cost variables W. And then there's a fixed cost term F. If we assume that this the sort of epsilon error at the end is distributed standard normal, we get this nice probit model, which that the probability that the increasing return sector is profitable and you can adopt the technology is given by a probit function of the market size. And I'll say that this is exactly the functional form from the Murphy, Schleifer, Vishny paper. So we'll go here. So the market size, we have a number of terms. So one is the population. That's how everything that doesn't have a parameter. So scale will just be in terms of population. We then have the middle class. So that's the proxy for the share of population owning shares and that can benefit from these income shocks. And then we have two measures of the international market size. Actually, let me just say, so the per capita variable profit term, that's the link back to the Murphy, Schleifer, Vishny. So you have these two potential sources of wealth. We're going to say that's a past shock to exports or a past shock to agricultural productivity, and then those get multiplied by the size of the market or the size of the middle class, and that money is redistributed, into more demand. So that the multiplier is the key form. Back up to market size. We're going to measure the size of the integrated market in two ways, and this is where we draw on the Hoffman, Osnago, and Ruta database, the vertical integration, vertical deep trade, vertical depth, agreements. And so we're going to measure market size basically as a function of the sum of all the markets that that are in the world, weighted by the provisions to deep trade agreements with those markets. And then we can measure the size of that integrated market relative to both your population and income. And then we're going to add some fixed cost terms. We'll have these be, you can think of these as controls, but they're sort of part climate and other. I'm going to try to, I realize I'm kind of slow, so I'm going to try to move very quickly. In terms of our outcome, so I said, what happens when you cross this profit threshold? We're going to have, that's going to be a 1-0 measure for sustained poverty reduction. So what we do is we take the poverty headcount ratio from PopCalNet. We look at what it is in every year using linear interpolation, and then in each 5-year window, we say, was the poverty rate declining in all 5 years? And if it was, then this indicator is 1, otherwise 0. So the outcome is sustained poverty reduction, which is a mirror to this, adopting the technology and having wages rise and poverty fall. So the first thing I want to show you is just a summary of this data. And I think an important thing to highlight here is that sustained poverty reduction is not the same as GDP per capita growth. So on the in the columns we have 1-0 was GDP per capita growing in all 5 years, and then in the rows we have was poverty being reduced in all 5 years. And you can see here with this 82 that there's a lot of instances of GDP per capita growth, but without sustained poverty reduction. So we really are looking at something different here in terms of the welfare implications. You know, we know from Hart's papers that growth is good for the poor, but it's also not sufficient for sustained poverty reduction. This is just a summary of the variables. So we see that, actually in the most recent decades in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, East Asia, where times have actually, or overall even, very high poverty reduction. So the share of periods in which there was sustained poverty reduction is substantial. Now we get into measuring the market size. So this is a typology of the variables. So what we do here is, while the Hoffman, Osnago, and Ruta paper looked at the horizontal depth of preferential trade agreements, we've just expanded this to include also provisions from the WTO and the GATT and also the public procurement agreement, so that we can look back further into time as to how people have integrated both through preferential trade agreements and the multilateral international ones. And so here's what we find. So these lines show you the relative size of the international market for the average country in each region, in terms of both population and in terms of GDP per capita. So what you can see here, and so this is just a way of representing the deep trade agreements database, but by summarizing it in terms of the share of the market that it gives. You see this in terms of in population. Interestingly enough, Africa is actually quite ahead in terms of integrating. It integrated very quickly through the WTO. Here you see a big spike in the 90s. Again, when China joins in 2001, there's a big gap and a big spike in the relative population of every market. But what's perhaps more interesting is looking at the right-hand side, where you see that for South Asia, the red line, and Sub-Saharan Africa, the lavender line, actually there's a peak but in the 90s of how relatively high income, or the relative income of the market. So that was actually a peak of the size of the market in terms of how rich it was. And actually, as other countries join the WTO, that declines over time. So, here we have a lot of variation in the markets, in the size of the markets that countries face, coming from other countries joining particular trade agreements. And so that's going to be the variation we use. And here, just to give you another example of that, here's just the size, the income, and the population of the WTO member states overall. You can see in 2001, there's a big increase in the population, but then income, actually dropped substantially because China joined. It had a very large population, but it was also relatively lower income. So, one of the ideas here is actually that, maybe since, as we find in our estimates, selling to a relatively higher income market is the most valuable, actually having China join the WTO reduced perhaps a little bit some of the value of the market, because countries are now facing a competitor, and also that demand doesn't have as high income as, say, the US or the UK. So here are all the variables we use in the estimation. I showed you the equations before. I just want to point out a few things. So one, this is the size of the middle class. It's positively related to GDP per capita on the x-axis, but there's a lot of variations there. So clearly, there's a lot, countries can have varying degrees of equality. Most interesting, perhaps, is that the relative income of the integrated market is falling very rapidly with income. And why is that important? There's a Martin Ravalian paper in the AER, I think 2001, in which he shows, no, sorry, later than that, 2011 or 12, in which he shows that there's actually been there's no poverty convergence. So if you start as a poor country, poverty declines more quickly. Here, the relative income of the integrated market is going to be a variable that actually positively predicts poverty reduction, and it's actually higher for countries of lower income. And so the final thing I'd like to point out is just these exports and agricultural productivity. Those were going to be those multiplying variables, and you really, these look, from this data, like basically random noise. So it's a shock that countries happen, but it's not correlated very well with income per capita, and that's where the wealth shock in the Murphy-Schafer-Vishny model comes from. So here are the results. So we estimated the model. We calculated first the threshold. So you take the ratio of fixed costs and variable costs using the Brezhnev and Rees approach, and that suggests that the market size in terms of people with income less than the middle class is about 320 million. So that's quite big, right? Obviously, a lot of countries don't have that population, but it's basically turning into person equivalent units the size of the international market and the middle class. And so we show here two lines. These are two bars, excuse me. So the blue bars are the model which allows for the size of the integrated international market. So in terms of population and GDP, I'll say that the quantitative magnitude of the coefficient on GDP per capita is very, very large relative to the population. So we have this example in the paper that says, if Afghanistan was considering integrating with Pakistan or Iran, even though Pakistan is much more populous than Iran, the higher income of Iran makes it sort of much more valuable in terms of potential poverty alleviation. So we understand that there's a bigger effect of the richer markets. So what this shows is that with international integration, there was a path on average to reducing poverty. So even in the second, third, and fourth decile of GDP per capita, these very poor countries, with international integration, they're actually able to get over the threshold on average. And so this shows us that there is this big gain for poverty reduction from deep trading agreements. But when you shut that down, so we just set the coefficients equal to 0 and say, well, what only does the middle class and population give you? Here, the countries below the sixth decile in red are not able to achieve development. Here is another way of looking at this through the World Bank regional classifications. And what you see here is that actually sub-Saharan Africa appears, and these are just averages. So I think I'll direct you to the paper. There's an appendix which has every country. And importantly, the South Asia example here does not include, the column does not include India because they didn't report a poverty headcount in the most recent period. But what this shows is that in South Asia, on average, international integration really is, going to be pivotal for allowing countries to transition. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, there may be concerns that actually the market is still not large enough, although international integration really helps. So to conclude, what should you take from this? So for a small country, if you believe this market size framework, within this market size framework, it's nearly impossible for a country to eliminate poverty with a closed economy. In a time when there's maybe declining interest internationally in international integration, the size of the domestic market can compensate for the absence of trade. But the unfortunate thing about this is that the market needs to be very large. It's about 300 million people is what we, again in converting everything into person units. And however, so it does need to be very large, but it seems that with the level of international integration we have at the moment, some economies and many economies have actually reached this threshold. So again, I'll point you to the paper. So the question really is, what should a small country do? And in this framework, there's two options. The one would be more integration through more provisions, as the ones that are measured in the data set we used for this paper. And the alternative is equality. So the idea is that you can, if you redistribute shares and a greater share of the country's profits are held by the middle class, that will translate to more demand. So, in the current environment where integration may be becoming more shallow, where the advantages of the comparative advantage of a cheap labor may be declining due to automation, equality, more equality, and a larger middle class is a complement of and not a substitute for growth. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tristan. We have a little bit of time for questions. So if there are any questions for Tristan, please come in, or you can send me a chat and I'll call on you. Maybe I have just one question,
Sure.
which I was, when you were doing this and for Africa in that penultimate slide, and for Africa, it was still below the integration necessary. Can you just explain, is that based on current integration levels, regional integration, or global? Because I wasn't exactly clear, and I think it makes a big difference in terms of what you might want to consider as alternative counterfactuals to see what would get them above the line.
Sure. So yeah, I want to I think maybe down weight that slide a little bit, because the average, I think, for Africa is maybe not the most informative. A few things are going on. So one is that a lot of countries there are quite small just in terms of population, so that has a first order effect. The international integration as measured, though, it is current, so it's up to 2015. It also includes, all agreements. So preferential trade agreements, a provision in each additional agreement will be included. It also includes the WTO and its various articles and provisions. But one thing we could do would be actually to, if you go back to that table I had, we could say, what if you took out, the countervailing measure ones and see how, how much of a difference that made. What if you took out, just the preferential trade agreements, how big a difference, that made. So, but that's a good idea.
Tristan and Caroline, as Jeff Bergstrand, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, please come in.
Hi, Tristan. And as you know, I'll be writing more detailed comments later. But just a quick question on your measurement of international integration. You use two different methods. So one is population weighted of the markets, and you do this for each country, and one is the per capita income. But there was no adjustment for distance. In other words, you use the example of for Afghanistan of Iran versus Pakistan, which are maybe roughly about the same distance. But it would seem that some of your results could be influenced on that by adjusting those per capita incomes or population by distance, since you're doing it for each country. Any thoughts on that? And I'll provide more comments later.
Yeah, so I think what we wanted to do here was, just so as a baseline, let's say, take the international integration itself as a measure of distance. So, here we're even if you're very close to a country, if you don't have any agreements with them, that the market size will be zero. So we're isolating, the effect of the agreements themselves. We did do, I think, early in the project, I think I did do a version where I had a kind of market access equation where there was some inverse trade costs weighted. I think either I can't remember the actual results of it, but I think went for this one because it was similar. But I think that's one thing I can bring back to just see if it makes a difference.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Tristan. Can you hear me? Yes. Do you include those communist country, former Soviet bloc countries in your analysis? Because arguably these countries will have less inequality and a sizable middle income group.
Yes, so there are a number of countries in the database. I guess, to the extent that poverty data is not observed there, prior to the 90s, that those early observations won't be there, but definitely, Eastern Europe and integration with the European Union is part of that story, part of the data set. Don't be shy, people.
Sorry. So does it mean that these former Soviet countries will have better chance to achieve development because they have larger
yes, I think that
middle
would be
income group,
that would
as
be
well as
consistent.
more equitable distribution?
Yes, that would be consistent with the model. So both, more economic integration through the links with Europe, and then also the greater size of the middle class. And I want to emphasize, I mean, we don't have direct evidence on this, but this share ownership in the local firms is the mechanism through which that would take place. Vietnam is another example.
Yes, Vietnam, China, and Poland, all these are highlighted in our GBC report last year because they are integrated into GBC framework through international integration. So those countries are good examples.
Yes. I would say also we've been invited to translate this paper into Chinese for Chinese universities, because I mean, clearly it shows that a big market is good for poverty reduction.
All right.
Tristan, hi, this is Michele. A question along the lines of what Jeff was asking. Did you try to exploit the richness in the trade agreements data in the sense you may want to look at the provisions that more directly relate to market integration, and there are others, I'm thinking of labor provisions that are less directly relevant, so you can exploit also that aspect.
Yeah, so I did try to run this yesterday, and I did. I think the issue is that the standard errors are large, and so it does tend to be difficult to see differences. I think one point I will make, though, is that I did test sort of looking at market size just defined by the WTO and GATT, and then just defined by the preferential trade agreement. And the threshold market size that you estimate in the SIMBA is actually very similar. So it doesn't seem to change, the overall conclusions, while, the loading of income, the coefficient on GDP per capita, may be a little bit different between those two coefficients. The overall conclusion about market size doesn't change that much. So I think, in that sense, we're sort of agnostic about the types, just saying, all integration is good, but in terms of where countries have an opportunity to integrate more, it'll be on those additional provisions that haven't been done already. So like labor, for example.
Okay, great. I think we're just on time. So why don't we move to the next paper? And I think we have Tom Zylkin.
Okay, so let me do the usual sound check. Everyone can hear me in World Bank land?
Yep, we hear you well.
Okay, and I will share my screen and see what happens then. Okay, so this looks pretty good. I think I move this to a different monitor. All right, so let me start by saying this is preliminary work I have with Michele and Nadia, and also Holger, Breinlich, Valentina, Corradi, and Santos, Silva, all of University of Surrey. This is preliminary work, so thank you very much for having it on the program. And thanks also to the organizers for giving their blessing to letting me present this in front of my students at the same time. This will be an interesting experiment. So I have my Principles of Microeconomics student behind my laptop here. All right, so our starting point is that free trade agreements contain a lot of provisions. And when I say a lot of provisions, it's a very diverse array. So I list some examples here: competition policy, patent protection, financial regulations, environmental and labor standards, and so much more that I could name here, like different ways of trying to either increase trade or otherwise tie two countries together economically. And furthermore, different free trade agreements have very different versions of these provisions. So two agreements might have some sort of chapter on competition policy, to pick on that, but NAFTA and the EU might approach it differently. Mercosur, a free trade agreement in South America, might approach it differently. ECOWAS in Western Africa might approach these issues differently as well. That means there's a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in free trade agreements. And ideally, we'd like to use that heterogeneity, that information, to say something about what a prospective free trade agreement, a new free trade agreement, is actually going to do, what economic impact is going to have. And I mean, the whole point of this conference is that this is very valuable data, and yet it's not being used to its fullest extent. So here I list just some topical free trade agreements that have been in the news. Obviously, all involve the UK, but this is a perennially important issue for policymakers. Just trying to understand when they include a certain provision in their free trade agreement, what exactly is that going to do for their economy in general, but trade specifically. And the reason why there's been a lot of difficulty, why economists, I guess, have been slow to take this approach of using this information to modeling the effects of trade agreements, is really the methodological challenges involved. Okay, so to break this down, there are two main difficulties when it comes to modeling the effects of free trade agreements using this rich data on trade agreement provisions. So first, modeling trade data in the first place is complex. It's known to have a lot of estimation challenges. Those just involve the nature of trade data and how we tend to think about the models behind trade data. And second, even though we have standard approaches now in international trade to deal with those challenges, what you add here now is a large number of provision variables you can consider. Whenever you have a very large number of variables, and I'll talk about just how large this data is, you have what's called an overfitting problem. You can't really tell which variables are explaining what is actually going on in the data. And that's what we really want to do here. We want to be able to forecast the effects of free trade agreements, or at least come up with a model that can tell us, okay, this provision is important, these others might not be. And so this paper tries to fit into exactly that gap. We're going to combine a lasso-based method from machine learning literature with the kinds of methods that have become popular recently in the estimation of trade agreements. Put those two things together using some recent computational innovations in the high-dimensional fixed effects literature. Add to that the plug-in lasso method from Bologna et al., this paper mentioned here. And then we're also going to do another piece of this, which is I'll talk about, that we call an iceberg lasso, where after we find what provisions we think are most important, we're going to see what other provisions they may be correlated. That's going to be a way of talking about whether or not there are bundling effects. Okay, so we might say that we might find using our method that this particular provision seems to be important, but then we want to see, does that appear with other provisions? Are we potentially picking up like a bundling effect as opposed to the effect of that specific provision? And here's what we're going to find. So our method kind of does a nice job of picking out only 7 provisions. So it's very parsimonious. And those 7 provisions that seem to be driving trade span a range of different policy areas, but they seem to have one thing in common, and that's that they tend to create more predictability. So you notice here I list anti-dumping. So they create more predictability regarding how anti-dumping investigations will be conducted, what the penalties will be. And likewise, there's a provision that creates more transparency about how anti-competition investigations will be carried out. Likewise, what the penalties will be when a country is found to violate the anti-subsidy provision. And also some, Roberta, you trying to annotate something? I got to get rid of this, sorry. And then we also have provisions you might expect on non-tariff barriers, technical barriers to trade. So how differences in product standards might impede trade. And as a caveat, we do indeed find that these provisions tend to be bundled with other similar things. Okay, so all together, we're taking a big data set and we're using a machine learning method to learn which are the provisions that actually matter for trade. And so we have some answers there, but also some uncertainty because we do find that those provisions are correlated with other things. Okay, and so just to mention some papers that we're kind of relating ourselves to, there are some earlier papers by economists that have used similar methods on the trade side, but have still struggled in one way or another with a high amount of collinearity between all of these provisions. And then the other two sets of papers I mentioned here, those are the two areas we're looking to connect in this paper. So let's get back to the methodological challenges that I mentioned. So first we have on the trade side, just how do you model trade data? I want to talk about that for a little bit. And then I'll talk about the added challenge that arises when you have a large number of provision variables. Like why can't we just take the methods that have become popular in trade off the shelf and apply them to this data? Okay, so this is a picture of some trade data. And what's complicated about trade data is that it involves a many country world. Every country trades with every other country, both as an exporter and as an importer, and they do so repeatedly over time. And if you really want to model this seriously, you need to take into account all the interconnectivity as well as how things change over time. So in this example, we're asking, did the 2005 US-Australia Free Trade Agreement increase trades? Look over here at pairs that involve US and Australia. It's a very simple data set, just have 3 countries, but you see that does give you a lot of information. The real data set has 200 countries, so it's a very big data set and has a very complex network to it, much far beyond this. But nonetheless, this is useful for conveying some key ideas. So if I focus on US exports to Australia, you can see that those did indeed grow after the trade agreement, but that's not completely informative about the effect of this free trade agreement, because I could also look at how trade between US and Japan grew. And you could see that that also increased during that same time span. And likewise, Japan's imports likewise, Australia's imports from Japan also grew between 2002 and 2007. Not necessarily isolate what the trade agreement did, just looking at bilateral trade flows between US and Australia, we have to come up with some baselines that involve their trade with third countries. Here, Japan is the third country. And so the way we do this when we have this huge data set with so many countries is we introduce parameters that capture essentially changes in supply conditions in the exporter and changes in demand conditions in the importer. Okay, so we have an exporter time fixed effect, an importer time fixed effect, and then an exporter-importer fixed effect that captures existing trade frictions for each pair. This is how we can say we're using changes over time, whereas these two fixed effects mean that we are always comparing to changes in trade for both the exporter and the importer in general. Finally, we're going to estimate this thing using what you can see as an exponential model, a nonlinear model. This allows for the possibility that trade could be zero. Sometimes 2 countries don't trade. And in addition, it has some nice properties that allow us to be very flexible in how we think about this noise term, the part that we can't explain. So just to underline what the sources of complexity are when working with trade data, first, you have to use a nonlinear model, at least it's widely recommended to do so. And second, we have 3 high-dimensional fixed effects. We have to estimate an individual parameter for every exporter time combination, every importer time combination, and every exporter-importer combination. With 200 countries and 10 years, you're going to have 40,000 pair of fixed effects and thousands of these things as well. Nonetheless, some recent computational advances have made this simple to do, and this is becoming increasingly popular and increasingly accepted. So we do have in the trade literature solutions to this problem that we can use. The problem is our data in this application looks like this. We're not just trying to estimate the effect of a single free trade agreement or a single free trade agreement variable. Instead, we have lots of different provision variables. And as I discussed at the beginning, when you have lots and lots of different explanatory variables, you need to be worried about what's called overfitting. Am I explaining the noise in the data, like the part that isn't really what's causing what's going on? Or am I explaining like what I actually am after, what the economic relationships are? So let me try and illustrate that using a picture. So in this picture, the true relationship that is driving this data is just a simple linear model, like y equals 0.5 times x plus a random noise term. So you see these dots are randomly distributed around the truth. And the best way to actually fit this relationship would be a simple linear fit. They regress y, the outcome on x, just one variable, and you see that also gives you a linear relationship. It's not quite as good as the truth, but it gets the basic idea right, and the prediction error isn't huge. Now, I could also introduce additional variables. So here I have a polynomial fit with x squared, x third, and x to the fourth. So this other fitted line is a polynomial function. And The problem here is that even though this is getting better at explaining the data, the part of the data that's explaining is the noise. Okay, so put another way, this curve here explains the dots better than this one does, but it's actually getting worse at telling me what's really going on. Okay, so we need to be wary of this problem, and we need a method for isolating which are the variables that are really important. So, so in other words, if I go back here, right, if we just had this data set up, we'd be fine, but here we need a method to isolate what's important. So speaking of the data, not too much to say about this because I think everyone is at least a little bit familiar with what we're working with. The original data set with all the different provision types across all different policy areas would be 937 variables. We are working with only the essential ones. So we've gotten rid of what we say to be corollaries and definitions, things that we don't think are essential for creating trade. But you can see that still gives us a lot of diversity across all of these policy areas. So this is what we actually do. This is a representation of our actual method. How you can interpret this is, if I just got rid of this term here, this would be the standard way of modeling trade flows or estimating the effects of a trade agreement. This is a penalty term that is going to penalize coefficients that we're going to estimate for each provision. So when this lambda term here is large, it means that your estimates for each provision are going to get shrunken, right? So if this is large, this penalty gets bigger. And if you're trying to minimize this function, you got to be very wary of this penalty function. Okay, and these betas, these are the estimates for each trade agreement provision. So the larger lambda is, the more likely that you're going to have a exactly zero estimate for a provision variable. And as you make lambda smaller, this thing becomes less and less strict. And so more and more provisions are going to be determined to have non-zero effects. More and more provisions are going to be selected. Okay, so this is the idea behind how this method works in machine learning. What we've done is combine it with a trade model. And to give you a more intuitive sense of how it works, like here's a visualization. Okay, so how should you interpret what you're looking at here? These are the different estimates that you get as you kind of turn the knob, as you make lambda less and less strict. Okay, so strict penalties are over here, less strict penalties are over here. So on the extreme right, you can see that we're getting stuff that's not really all that interpretable. Lots of negative and large values. We're not really sure what that would mean. And if you went further and further to the right, this is going to just blow up with very blue and very red squares, things that we're not going to be able to believe. On the extreme left, you're picking out only the things that are super, super important to the actual fit of the model. So over where we have lambda equals 0.025, we're only picking out competition policy 23, which is a provision that I'll discuss momentarily because it'll show up later in our preferred method. To give you an idea of just all the variables that are included, we have different, this is like a continuation of the same figure across all of these policy areas. You can see the patterns are similar. And in general, as you make lambda less and less strict, you're going to select more and more variables. I don't necessarily have time to go through all of these. So that raises the question, like if changing lambda affects which variables are included, how do you choose the right values for lambda, as well as what we'll sometimes introduce as a provision-specific penalty, this phi k right here? Well, there's two methods we consider. So first is the classic machine learning approach, which is to drop some agreements in the data and then try and predict their effects sight unseen, and then pick whatever lambda produces the best predicted fit. An issue with this approach is that it's known to be too lenient. It errs on the side of always including provisions that it finds to be important, even if it means including many provisions that aren't important. So at our preferred lambda, we actually pick 70 provisions. And it's just not a very parsimonious model. It gives us a lot of coefficients that are very hard to explain. And we just don't believe those coefficients. Like it's a lot of large negative and positive values that don't seem plausible. Our preferred method is what's called a plug-in method. And so this does not involve cross-validation, but it has some very nice features that are great for working with for economic data, especially panel data. So among other things, it's stricter than cross-validation. It focuses on just picking things that are important and excluding things that are unimportant. There's a statistical argument for how the lambda parameter is chosen. We choose it so that only variables that have a large effect on the fit are chosen, and it has to be large relative to the standard error. And also, if there are any if the error term in the estimation behaves non-uniformly across all the different observations, and perhaps if they are correlated across time for the same pair, that can create problems for the standard lasso method, and the penalty weights that are involved in this second method actually take care of this and allow us to get consistent estimates. So this is our preferred method, and let me show you what we get when we do this. But though I'll start with by just talking about what, as a baseline, what we get for the overall effect of a free trade agreement. So this is just if we had one free trade agreement variable in our data. This is like we're assuming a uniform free trade agreement effect for all the different free trade agreements in our data. So we find on average they increase trade by about 11%, okay, which is reasonable enough. Then in columns 2, 3, and 4, I'm going to show you the variables that we selected to be important predictors. And so those provisions are anti-dumping, whether or not there's been a material injury, competition policy. This provision, it could refer to various things, but it encourages competition authorities to work together when there's been some sort of violation. They have to inform one another. And there's another provision that specifies the discipline to be used when there's a violation of the subsidies provision. And then in addition to that, there are several provisions that govern how technical barriers to trade will be removed. So they say that two countries, for example, have to set the same standards. How are they going to do that? Well, they could use either regional standards or international standards, and some trade agreements actually do a mix of both. And I guess what's interesting to point out here in column 4 is that if we do just plain old PPML, this is the unpenalized model, with these provision variables included, you can see it explains amazingly 100% of the average effect of an FTA. So I'm not sure if that's a coincidence or not, but we call that something of a success. We were very, very happy to see that. And then in the remaining columns, because a lot of these provisions were common to the European Union, which of course is a big part of the data in terms of the number of pairs it entails, we were curious if we were just picking up an EU effect. So we included the EU as a predictor in the lasso step, and we found that it is an important predictor, but it does not affect the selection of these other variables. So these things do generalize beyond the EU. Okay. And then, as I said, there's also a second step to this. So once we've selected these 7 variables and found them to be important for explaining the effects of trade agreements, the next thing we wanted to do was check as a kind of a sanity check, well, are we really picking up the effects of those variables or other variables that may be correlated with them? And that's important because we can't really claim 100% that there's a causal effect we're picking up here that's specific to only these provisions. So we regress these selected provisions on all the other ones in the data, just to see like how highly correlated they are. Now, when you have a lot of provisions, it's to be expected that you're going to get a high correlation when you use all the others. So we used a lasso method here as well to select only the salient ones to see, is there a certain group of provisions that really goes together with the ones we're selecting? And in most cases, that's true as well. You see a lot of high goodness of fit statistics reported here. So for example, there's just a few other variables that are that explain 95% of the variation in this anti-dumping variable. So here are more details on that. And they're interesting. So often what you see, as you would expect, there's high correlations within the same policy area. So across the top here, again, we have the selected provisions. And then in each column, you have the other provisions that were selected by lasso in the iceberg lasso step, where we performed a second stage lasso of selected provisions on non-selected provisions. So in anti-dumping, for example, you can see, as you'd expect, it's correlated with other anti-dumping provisions. There's also this environmental provision that gets included as well. We think that's a template effect because this turns out to be perfectly correlated with these other ones. Turning to competition policy, you can see, as expected, our competition policy variable we selected is correlated with more competition policy stuff. And it's negatively correlated with IPR. We think, again, that could be a template effect. Maybe the EU likes competition policy provisions and some other big player like the US prefers IPR provisions, perhaps. As we look at subsidy policy, again, it's highly correlated with some of the same competition policy variables. And these show up again over here under TBT 33, which is one of the technical barriers to trade variables. So we get a good sense here that competition policy is important for trade because we are seeing a lot of competition policy variables show up as collinear with the variables that we are selecting. Okay. So I'll conclude here. What did we do in this paper? So we combine a lasso method from machine learning literature, like a statistical learning method, to learn which of the provisions in this great data set that's been made available by the World Bank are important for explaining the effects of trade agreements and we combine it with some of the latest methods in the international trade literature for empirical trade policy analysis. We find there are 7 provisions using our preferred method, and what those 7 provisions seem to have in common is they promote more predictability in their respective policy areas. Those areas were anti-dumping investigations, competition policy, and technical barriers to trade. These provisions also turned out to be entangled with other provisions whose role may be obscured by the collinearity we have in the data. That's obviously something we need to work on, look at more. And so in our further work, we intend to look more closely at how confident can we be in a causal interpretation of our results in the presence of this high collinearity. We also want to use our model to examine and highlight heterogeneous effects of trade agreements, so we could look back at NAFTA, look at the EU, look at ECOWAS, and say, well, what were their effects based on our model? And likewise, we can predict the effects of prospective agreements, such as a potential US-UK agreement, which obviously is something that's on a lot of people's minds these days. And we've done this just using a couple of methods taken over from machine learning literature. Our approach, though, could be generalized and combined with lots of different things that are popular in machine learning. Basically, we've just taken the first few steps.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting to see machine learning in trade. I think this might be the first use of this method I've seen. Just one question about causation. I think collinearity is not the only problem here. There's also an issue of endogeneity in the sense that in a group of countries where you know trade's going to increase a lot, maybe you're more likely to include these provisions where you're really concerned about, because there's no reason why things like state-owned enterprises or IPRs or some of these, they should actually in some sense reduce trade. But you might be more likely to include these provisions in agreements that are really impactful. So I think on causation, it's not just the collinearity, which, I mean, these also came on later and in groups, as you mentioned. But let me open the floor, and why don't we take a few questions and then turn back to you.
Can I start off?
Sure.
Jeff Berkshire. I'm going to just real 2 quick things. One, Tom, as I look at some of these, first of all, fascinating analysis, especially kind of narrowing down to those 7 provisions, I thought was very credible. Several of those, I mean, they're kind of in 4 basic groups, but they all look like kind of fixed cost effects. And you all said they kind of reduce uncertainty. And I'm just wondering if, in terms of your analysis, did you guys on economic grounds think about those as all factors that can reduce export fixed costs? So maybe you can comment on that. I'm going to just add 1 second question, Tom, and you can do this offline and email me. Always curious, you include zeros. We have the pair fixed effects IJ in there, so this is obviously a technical question. Can that account for the zeros basically, and is that not much of a factor in doing some of the regressions? But that's an econometric issue. You can email me offline.
Yes, we're okay there, but I'll email you. Your first question is, have we thought about export and fixed costs? No, but I think that's a great comment.
Questions before we go back to you, Tom?
Oh, you want more questions?
I want to just collect the questions.
Are you gonna summarize them for me?
In case there's any other ones.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Tristan. I just wanted to know if those same regressions, so once you've identified the variables, what happens if you include the tariff rate in there? Because I think, it's interesting just to compare the effect of dropping tariffs specifically to all these other provisions. Over.
Did I answer that?
I have a question. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, go ahead, Penny.
So thank you very much. That's very interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking of how exactly can trade economists benefit from this information. And so I had 2 thoughts. One is, for a paper like the one that Tristan just presented, I can imagine that we use your analysis as a first step. So we identify those provisions that, based on your analysis, seem most important. And then when we weigh, when we use weights to create the market size, then we incorporate this information to create appropriate weights. So I'm not exactly sure how we would do that, but I think it could be very useful in that regard. But then I was thinking another use that I'm more skeptical about is someone might be tempted to say, so here are the 7 provisions that matter. Perhaps these are the only things we should focus on or trade negotiators, rather than having these marathon meetings where they negotiate about everything, they just focus on these 7 things. And I think this is, I'm not quite sure that conclusion would be valid, because many of these agreements are negotiated as packages. So based on the tit for tat approach, so there could be some provision that's totally minor and irrelevant and marginal for most of the world, but there is one particular lobby that wants it, and if you don't pass it, nothing happens. So it, you know what I'm saying, that it could be that without having the full package, nothing can get passed. And
can I ask something?
A similar question. Can I?
Oh, sorry.
hi, Paula.
Hi. Can I ask a question picking up on, following on, or I can
turn back to the author to keep a little bit on time. Paula.
Yeah, no, I was actually thinking along the lines of Penny, and during the presentation, I was thinking very much of our own work that I'm presenting next week about lobbying and firm level lobbying on these provisions. As you'll see, we really see from these detailed lobbying reports that firms are saying, I'm interested in these IPR provisions, these anti-dumping provisions. So I'm going to show you that a lot of what you see in the content of trade agreement is endogenous and driven by these large multinationals lobbying for the inclusion of these provisions, particularly when the agreements are with large FTA trading partners. So I would say, so that we know that these are the most important ones, but I would be very wary about taking them as exogenous in light of what I've seen and what I will show you.
Can I piggyback on those comments as well? Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Scott, and then we'll turn back to Tom.
Yeah. So an approach I've taken, and I would ask the authors also look at, is you could also use machine learning in terms of looking at cluster analysis, because that puts the provisions in different clusters, and they almost fall into natural economic space of deep provisions, kind of shallow provisions, and then also gives you some idea of what, again, of the endogeneity of the negotiating process, of what type of countries tend to cluster and have these provisions, and what other countries tend to have these other type of provisions. Again, the good one is state-owned enterprises. You wouldn't see that in a lot of different provisions, but it usually gets packaged to achieve something else, and maybe some other provision gets thrown in. So again, another way of using machine learning is to use cluster analysis, 1, to see how the provisions are packaged together, and 2, to give us some idea of perhaps the negotiating process of how we came about with this bundle of provisions. Thank you.
So as you can see, there's a lot of interest in this work. Tom, back to you.
So I'll try and take them in reverse order. So Scott, I love cluster analysis. We've also thought about factor analysis. Probably think some more about that and get back to you. Penny and Paula, thank you. I think I'll start with what Penny was saying about, like, could you use this method to model how effective a trade agreement would be? Yes, I think so, because at the end of the day, it's a predictive method that I think is especially useful in the hands of an econometrician who cannot affect policy. So to speak to your other comments, like about, well, is it really the individual provisions or is it the bundles? Probably, I think it is to some extent the bundles. And so we can't go to a policymaker and say, competition policy 23, that's the secret sauce here. But still, we can use these estimates to guide our understanding of what trade agreements have done. And if we're kind of apart from the policymaking process, we can make our predictions about future agreements. And I think as we refine this work, we can get back to that question of, well, how do we predict the effects of free trade agreements? Now, if we want to do away with interpretability of the results, there are methods that are well suited for prediction. But at the same time, we think policymakers want to know what provisions do what. And so that's something we want to work on some more. I think, and both Caroline and Paola talked about endogeneity. So I think standard caveats apply with these methods. This is not specific to our application. This applies to all trade policy analysis that uses the three-way gravity model. You have to assume that that pair fixed effect takes care of the endogeneity of trade relations in place before the trade agreement is signed. I think that does become a stronger assumption. We have these provisions. There are robustness checks we can use, and we probably should look at to see if maybe there are anticipation effects that might indicate that there's reverse causality going on. Right? So we might be concerned that there's trade growth going on before the agreement, and the trade agreement was signed in response to that trade growth. That would be the standard concern. Tristan asked about tariffs. We don't have tariff data going back to 1964. Ideally, yes, we would love to do that. Jeff, you asked about fixed costs. Yes, I think that's an appropriate way to think about this, because the uncertainty that is resolved by these types of provisions is, as I understand it, isomorphic to reducing fixed costs. Right? So that's been the point of a lot of papers by Nuno Limau and Kyle Handley and others. And I hope I'm not missing anybody.
Great, thank you very much. So now we'll turn to the final paper by Lionel.
Thank you, I gotta go.
Equilibrium model.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. So may I share my screen now?
Yeah, I think we might have to lose Tom's screen. Perfect.
Okay, so do you see my screen?
Yes, we see this.
Okay, good. So good afternoon, or good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are. So this is a joint paper with Nadia Rocha, Michele Ruta, Gianluca Santoni. So this is very much work in progress. This is our first presentation. And so indeed, comments are very much welcome. So the background of this paper is as follows. We all know that much attention has been paid to the economic impact of preferential trade agreements. And as already discussed today, so not all agreements have similar ambition in terms of economic integration. So as said, these agreements are very heterogeneous, and so the provisions that are entailed in these agreements are very diverse. And so just to take two examples, one has been already discussed and the other not. So you may have, for instance, a provision of competition policy, and you may have a provision on public procurement. So when it comes to competition policy, this is something, leading to a level playing field, and so this would be good also for foreign competitors. So this would lead to trade creation. Now, if you consider public procurement, it's not necessarily the case. So it will facilitate trade within the agreement among members, but not necessarily vis-à-vis third countries. So provisions are very diverse, and you have to think of ways to group agreements by types based on their provisions and to assess the different economic impact of these different types of agreements. And so this is basically what we're going to do in this paper. So what we do, we rely actually on the three-step strategy. So the first step is to cluster the agreements based on their content in terms of provisions. So we start from the provisions and we aggregate the PTAs within clusters based on the proximity of their content in terms of provisions. So this is the first step. The second step is to proceed to an economic or econometric estimate of the impact of each type of preferential trade agreement. So we're going to use, not surprisingly, structural gravity. We'll include, it is worth noting, domestic flows in order to take into account the border effects. And the third step is to estimate counterfactuals. And in these counterfactuals, we will have country pairs signing new agreements. This is what I'm going to call the extensive margin of regional integration. Or they can also upgrade the type of agreement that they have from a shallow agreement to a more ambitious, to a deep agreement. And so this is what I'm going to call the intensive margin of regional integration. So to proceed, we use the database that has been used in other papers. So we have 937 provisions. We have 278 agreements. And importantly, these provisions, these 900 provisions, are grouped within 18 categories, such as competition policies, subsidies, public procurement, state-owned enterprises, TBTs, etc., etc. So at the end of the day, we end up with a matrix with 278 agreements and 937 possible provisions. And these provisions may be coded differently. So certain provisions will be coded 01, either you have this provision or not. And certain provision will be coded in terms of intensity, so 0, 1, 2, etc. And so by increasing, ambition of the provision. And so you have to make sure that you take all these dimensions on board when you try to group regional agreements within groups making sense. Okay, so we will be very parsimonious. So Tom was very parsimonious with 7 provisions only. We will be even more parsimonious because we have only 3 clusters. So by sake of clarity, and you will see why later on, I will just use the following wording. So we have the cluster of deep agreements, we have the cluster of medium agreements, and we have the cluster of shallow agreements. And so meaning that when you put this into a gravity estimation, then you get 3 different elasticity of trade to the presence of a PTA. And so this is what we're going to estimate with PPML, 3-West fixed effect. I will give you details later on. And we will correct for the incidental parameter problem using a fix that has been proposed by Tom precisely. The last step is to illustrate with an ex-ante exercise what we can do when we have all this machinery. And so what we're going to do, using the example of Latin America and Caribbean countries, is to show that it's much better to deepen existing agreements than signing new ones. So better prefer the intensive margin rather than the extensive margin when it comes to signing agreements. Okay, so the related literature, I will go very fast in the interest of time. So it's now well known that using the average impact of PTAs can be misleading. One solution could be to use CGEs in order to evaluate PTA by PTA what is the economic impact, but this is something which flies very well when it comes to considering the tariff cuts. But when it comes to considering behind the border measures like regulations and the rest, it's less the case. And so it's better to use endowment full general equilibrium models, and this is what we're going to do. And this rely on a literature that has been, initiated by Anderson and Van Winkoop and developed further afterwards. And we have today solutions in terms of, solving the model, which are equivalent to the Hat algebra when we use estimation, as shown by Anderson, Larch, and Yotov. So this is basically the background. So let me present the first step, which is the classification of PTAs. So recall that we have this big matrix of provisions. And so what we aim at doing is to assign a score to each agreement for each of the 18 categories of provisions. So recall that the 900 provisions will be, belonging to 18 categories. And so for each category, I will assign a score to each agreement. And I will show you how we do that in a second. The general idea is very simple. We just normalize each provision. And so we have a raw matrix, and then we end up with a normalized matrix and with a reduced matrix with only the 278 PTAs times the 18 groups of provisions. When you have this scoring somehow, you will use an algorithm, which is a clustering method, a very classical one. So we use the k-mean plus, but we could use different algorithms. So basically, the outcome is the same. And so we just partition the data based on this algorithm in order to obtain an optimal number of clusters in which preferential agreements are similar in terms of the provision they contain. Okay, so let's give an example of what we do to make it simple. So imagine a world where we consider one area of provisions. Recall that we have 18 areas, so we consider one area, let's call it XX. And within this area, we have 3 provisions, A, B, C. And the world is comprising actually 5 PTAs, PTA 1, PTA 2, PTA 3, they are in blue. So in PTA 1, if you take provision A for this area, so the code, this cell is coded 3, because this is very ambitious. Now, if you go to PTA number 2, for the same provision of the same area, it is coded only 1, so this is less ambitious. And if you go to PTA 3, this is 0, PTA 4, 0, etc. So the average of this is 0.8, and this is what I'm going to use to normalize this matrix and obtain the normalized matrix, which is here. And so, for instance, for provision A in cluster 1s, since this is 3 divided by 0.8, I get this 3.75. And you do the same for each cell. And at the end of the day, PTA by PTA, you compute the average of this, etc. And this last row in blue is the score by PTA that we obtain. And this score is the one that we're going to use in order to do the hierarchical clustering. Okay, so based on this, we obtain optimally 3 clusters. The first cluster will contain 23 agreements. So the EU is one of the 23 agreements. Cluster number 2 will be comprising 59 agreements. So NAFTA or Chile-Japan are 2 examples of agreements belonging to cluster 2. And the rest of the agreements are in the 3rd cluster. And so I anticipate a bit on the econometric results, but cluster 1 is the cluster providing the largest impact on trade. So this is where we have the highest elasticity. So I will call it deep. And, you know, the same way, medium and shallow for the 2 other clusters. Okay, so let's first characterize the content of clusters in order to see what are the differences in terms of provisions they contain. So in order to do that, we just run LPM regression and we compute the marginal effect of each policy area on the probability for a given agreement of being in the deep cluster versus the medium one, or being in the shallow cluster versus the medium one. So we have additional controls. I do not enter into the details, but I just show you the results. So interestingly, Tom has been extensively discussing the role of competition and the role of anti-dumping. And you see that in cluster 1, you know, having a provision on competition or having provisions on anti-dumping, so the score that you obtain for this group of provisions on competition, so the depth of your agreement in terms of competition provisions, the depth of your agreement in terms of anti-dumping, etc., is pushing towards cluster 1. While if you are very weak in terms of, you know, provisions for competition, anti-dumping, etc., then you are more plausibly in cluster number 3, which is the shallow agreement. So you can characterize the content of these agreements based on this criteria. And so now I go to the second step, and what I'm going to present is the econometric estimate that we are, you know, using in order to compute the elasticity that will be used afterwards for the counterfactuals. So as basically everyone today, we use PPML with panel data. Interestingly, we include intranational flows. So we have also a border effect in the model. And we interact this border dummy with an indicator for the decade, meaning that the impact of globalization will compete against the impact of relationalization in the model. And we don't use consecutive years for the reasons, technical reasons that are well known. And we use 5 years interval. And basically, we use UNIDO data because we need intranational trade, as I said. We use TradeProd, which is a database at CEPI, BASI, and we use an interpolation in order to obtain a bit more than 150 countries. So this is basically the equation. So it looks very much like the equation that we have seen before in a former presentation. So here we have a bilateral fixed effect. We have an exporter time fixed effect, and we have an importer time fixed effect. Here we have the border dummy interacted with time, with the decade, and then we have the variable of interest. So Z is the cluster, so Z can be 1, 2, 3. 1 is the deep cluster, 3 is the shallow cluster. And so we obtain this parameter, this elasticity, beta Z. So we obtain 3 elasticities. And the 3 elasticities range from 0.16 to 0.38. And so, as I said before, cluster 1 has the largest impact on trade. And so this is why I categorize this cluster as being the deep cluster. Now, what we can do is to take this beta Z and to introduce the beta Z in a general equilibrium model in order to proceed with the estimation. And before doing this, I have to mention that we have this problem, which is known as the incidental parameter problem, because we are using three-way fixed effect with a limited number of periods. Recall that we are using, as I said before, 5 years intervals. And so we have a limited number of periods. And so by chance, Tom developed a fix that we use. And our results are robust to this change. Okay, so the third step is precisely to use our former results in order to run a series of counterfactual exercises where we modify, at the end of the day, the geography of preferential trade agreements. And so we could do many things, but in order to make it simple, I will just illustrate the method with Latin America and the Caribbeans. And we do 2 simulations with the general equilibrium model, one at the extensive margin and one at the intensive margin. So recall what I said. So the intensive margin is just the idea that you upgrade the cluster of your PTS. So if you are in cluster 3 or in cluster 2, you upgrade by signing new provisions, introducing new provisions in your agreement. You skip to cluster 1. And so you can do that within the existing agreements signed between Latin American and Caribbean countries, or you can do that for agreements signed by these Latin American and Caribbean countries and the rest of the world, including indeed Europe. So this is for the intensive margin. Now for the extensive margin. So what we do is that we sign unsigned agreements between Latin American countries. So when 2 countries in the region have no agreement together, we just sign an agreement with them, between them. And so it can be done with different level of ambition. So either you sign an agreement which belongs to cluster number 3, and so this is the pure extensive margin, because this is really the shallow regional integration, or you can go up to cluster number 1. And so in the general equilibrium model, when you shock your PTA matrix, there are indeed 2 channels of adjustment. So the direct effect, which is driven by the elasticity by the elasticity that we have been estimating before. And there is an indirect effect, which is induced by third country adjustments. And all this, indeed, is channeled through multilateral resistance terms. So these are the results. So I don't show you all the results because it would take too much time. You can refer to the paper. So at the intensive margin, so what you can look at is that you have here the average for Latin American and Caribbean countries in this row, okay? And so the first two columns correspond to, making progress at the intensive margin within Latin American countries. And the last two columns correspond to the intensive margin between the Latin American countries and agreements signed with the rest of the world, including, as I said, Europe. And so what you can see is that in terms of the change in exports and the change in GDP, there is, some action within the Latin American countries, but there is much to be gained by increasing the ambition of the agreements that are currently existing with other countries in the world. And the reason is that, these countries in the world are big markets, very rich, etc. And then we come back with this to the first presentation we had today. Now, when you look at different countries, so you see that for Barbados, for instance, you have a slight negative impact here. And so why is it like this? Just because these countries only participate to one regional agreement, which is already in cluster one. So there is no benefit for them if they participate to this movement of intensive margin. And so the only impact is the indirect effect, which is indeed negative here, because this is a slight trade diversion effect. On the contrary, if you take agreements with other countries in the world, then there is indeed a benefit. Now, at the extensive margin, because we are running out of time, we can see here, if we take the average impact for Latin American country, that it is very, very low. Whatever the choice you make. So indeed, if you just go from zero to a shallow agreement, there is basically nothing to be gained in terms of GDP. Recall that we are thinking of agreements signed within the region. If you go for the middle agreements, so this is a bit more, but still this is nothing. And even if you go to the deep agreements, so the remaining agreements have little action on the GDP. So with this, we can conclude. So we started with this detailed information on provision and for 278 PTAs. So we synthesize this into 3 clusters. Then we use a structural gravity model, including domestic flows, in order to compute the 3 elasticities that are associated with these 3 clusters. And then we have been running a general endowment, counterfactual at the intensive margin, at the extensive margin for the Latin American countries. And so we think that this exercise is policy relevant because the conclusion that we have is that the economic impact of the intensive margin of regionalization is much larger than the extensive one. So it's important to keep in mind that there is a need for a deep integration corresponding to a series of provisions which are very important. Thank you.
Excellent. It's really nice to make these papers together because I some of the results, especially from competition and other departments, are coming out as being especially important. So this idea really of deepening diversification reminds me of the natural trade partners literature, and perhaps they've signed on with the most important partners first, and now it's time to go deeper. Let me open the floor for questions.
I have a quick question. It's more of a methodological question, but one of the issues associated with using the k-means cluster is that there's it's a random starting point. So if I ran the model 10 times, I might get different groupings of different countries. And so then if I did the empirical estimates, I might get different empirical estimates on the impact of the trade agreement. So how do you adjust, or have you thought about adjusting for the essential inherent randomness of using k-means clustering to identify the groupings of the provisions, and then when you implement that into the empirical gravity model? But great paper. Thank you.
Thanks. Other questions?
Yeah, hi. Quick question. Can we compare the extensive and intensive margin across regions? Because it was clear from what you show that for Latin America, it's better to have deeper agreements with Europe. But I don't know, maybe I missed it. If we can know if it's better for Latin America to have deeper agreements within the region, or if it's better to have an extensive margin, more agreements outside the region.
Yeah, maybe for other regions too. If you've looked at other regions, is deeper always better? Other questions?
Hi, it's Marla Marishoska. If I can have a very quick question. I really like the paper. I think it's great work, and I'm looking forward to reading it in full. I have a quick question because at the beginning you said that there are differences how we should look at competition policy versus procurement, for example, in terms of leading to trade creation or trade diversion, how it affects countries within and outside of the agreement. And I'm curious how this is tackled in the model, because I think that would be an important contribution to make that distinction, but it wasn't clear to me. Thank you so much.
Other questions? Okay, why don't we return to the author?
Yes, do you hear me?
We hear you now.
So sorry, I'm lost in the buttons. You know, you have buttons on the screens everywhere. So at some point you don't remember where to click. So thanks for these questions. On Scott's question, so there is this issue of randomness, etc. And so what we do is that we have a loop, and so we proceed 250 times. In order to make sure that the clustering that we obtain is stable and optimal. So this is the outcome of this procedure. So if it were done once, it would be a problem, but we think that given the repeated, the repetition of the exercise, we get out of this trap. So now on Gaston's question, the comparison across regions. So there are two elements here. One is to compare the extensive and the intensive margin within the region with the extensive and intensive margin between countries in the region and the rest of the world. And so one element which is very important here and which is natural is the fact that gravity forces are there. So if you consider an agreement that can be extended or that can be deepened with Europe, so you currently have an agreement with Europe, with the European Union as a Latin American country, and you can deepen this agreement, then if you deepen the agreement, then there is an enormous benefit because this is a broad market, a very large market with very rich consumers, etc., etc. So this is something which is very, very important. And so now if you say, okay, what I do is that I go for the intensive margin within the region, and if you are already a large country in the region having signed with a small country in the region, then the benefit is more limited. But now, if you are a small country in the region, and if you can deepen the agreement with a large country in the region, like Argentina, Brazil, etc., you will gain a lot. So you have to factor in the gravity forces in order to understand exactly what happens. And what Caroline was also raising as a question, and this is related, is what about other regions? So because here we are drawing a conclusion based on this example of Latin America. And so maybe I was generalizing a bit by saying that it's better to go for deep agreements than to work at the extensive margin. And this was a bit in the spirit of this today's session. But to tell what we're going to do, so this is on the research agenda. We now gonna systematize this exercise, scan all the regions, all the directions, all the dimensions of the model in order to have something more systematic. But my guess is that the conclusion that we have for the moment should be quite robust to this extension, but I cannot guarantee. So we have to run the simulations to the counterfactuals to see what it gives. Now, on Marilla questions, the differences between clusters in terms of trade creation, trade diversion. So this is also something that we see in the model that or in the counterfactuals that we run. We see that the deep cluster is leading to economic effects which are much more trade creation than trade diversion. And so this is something which goes very much in line with the idea that deep integration is something favoring trade. So definitively, yes, we have this result that cluster number one is leading to more trade creation and less trade diversion. Thank you. And don't hesitate to send me a bunch of questions by email, so we will be pleased to consider them and to reply.
Thanks very much. I think it's really been a great session today. We've been able to see these three papers, and we've really been able to start utilizing the tremendous data effort that was undertaken at the World Bank to categorize these trade agreements, that before we would just put in these dummies for trade agreements, and now we can really look at these different provisions and start to understand which provisions are more impactful for trade. Though still we need to get through this idea of lobbying and potential endogeneity and so forth. But really exciting work. As I said at the beginning, we have a whole series on this topic, so please continue to tune in. I thought the papers today were excellent, great presentations and a good discussion. I don't know if Michele wants to add anything, because he's been a big force behind this deep trade agreement work and this seminar series before we head off. We're only a little bit over. Michele?
Now, thanks, Caroline. Thanks, everyone. I'm really pleased to see that there were over 100 people. At some point, we had 120. So please just keep joining us for the next webinars starting next week.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks to all the presenters and everyone who participated. Great to see you all, and looking forward to seeing you again next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.